Well, it's very interesting, this term, waking up. To me, it carries a kind of disembodied bias in it. Just the mere fact of when you wake, it's up. As you know, in my teaching, the whole question of waking up needs to be reformulated in a way, in the sense that from the viewpoint of Tibetan Buddhism, you don't need to wake up, actually, because there is a quality of being fully awake already in our state of being. And the really interesting question is going to sleep. What about that? And I think the way I would frame it is that we are constantly attempting to put ourselves asleep, and we put ourselves asleep by disregarding our experience and exiting into all kinds of thinking about our life and planning and thinking about spirituality and reading books, talking to people. And that's somnambulance from the viewpoint of Vajrayana Buddhism. What we need to do is to wake down, meaning that already within our somatic experience and within our body is a kind of brightness and splendor and awareness and presence that is a continuous thread in our life. So our problem is not that we have to wake up, but that we have to stop going to sleep.
Well, tell me more when you talk about tuning to this already present wakefulness, or what you're saying here, waking down. Tell me more about that. How might someone in this moment who's listening have a sense of what you're talking about?
Well, let's talk theoretically first, and we can talk practically.
Okay.
Theoretically, think about it. We have billions and billions of cells in our body, and each of these cells is a receptor of all the information in the universe. As we know from the work of Candace Pert and other neurobiologists and neuroscientists, at the cellular level, there is complete openness and awareness and awakeness in the very foundation of our physical being. And that awareness begins to form patterns of awareness in our body, and then communities of awareness, and pretty soon we have the awareness of the human person. But it's grounded in the body, and it comes from our cells. It's not something that's extraneous to our physical being. It's the very fundament and root of who we are as people. So when I talk about waking down, a very simple way to do it is to bring your awareness into your body and begin to feel what the interior life of the body is. At that point, you're beginning to wake up. You're beginning to wake up to who you actually are. One of the sort of interesting problems with spirituality in the modern world is this very deep bias that somehow awareness is something that operates independent of our body and independent of our somatic life and our emotions and our situations and our problems, and that we can somehow get some distance from that and look back on it from another point of view, which is the point of view of where we get when we wake up. And I think that up to a certain point, that kind of logic works, but a much more fruitful journey happens when we begin to discover awareness within our body at deeper and deeper and deeper levels, and discover that there is a kind of a quality of self-existing, selfless awareness in us already, and always has been there, and we just haven't noticed it before.
A lot of contemporary teachers talk about spiritual awakening as kind of like a line that gets crossed. Like there's before awakening and after awakening. And after awakening, you're forever changed in some way. And that seems like a very different paradigm than the one you're describing here. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, in our tradition, we talk about two kinds of awareness, as you know. One kind is that you've basically been checked out your whole life, and you're not aware that there is anything other than just the ups and downs of your relative life. It all feels very claustrophobic and prison-like. And then at a certain moment, there's a gap in that prison, and you begin to realize that there's a kind of infinity of awareness that is also part of your reality. And that's the first kind of, I would say, that's the first kind of awareness where you realize there is an alternative. And that can be a very profound and even shattering experience for people to realize that the person they thought they were isn't the final reality. But that's only the first step. In our tradition, to discover that there is such a thing as an infinite awareness is only the first step. Because what's happened is you now have dualism. You have the infinity of awareness, and then you have claustrophobic experience. And they appear to be separate things from one another. And there is a tendency to privilege the experience of no content, of awareness is just open and empty and free, privilege that over the gritty experience of being a human being. And there's a problem there, because when you're resting in open awareness, what about everything that you're not present to? What about your life? What about your karma? What about your situation? What about the emotions and the feelings that are always running on in people, whether they are particularly paying attention, and it's always there for everybody, as long as you're human. And so for us, there's a second step, which is that rather than finding awareness in separation from your psychophysical being, step number 2 is you come into your ordinary experience, you come into your body, and you begin through the somatic practices of our lineage to discover that there is, at the very core of every human experience, there is this vast, open, empty state of being. And that's, as I said before, that's true even at the cellular level. The more we explore our imprisonment and our entrapment in our own life, the more we discover that imprisonment is actually an illusion, that fundamentally everything that we are is constantly an expression of something that is infinite. It's the space in our cells. It's the space in our body. It's the space at the very center of our emotions. When you make that journey and you begin to realize that who you are fundamentally is awake, and that this awake gives birth to all kinds of energy that we then misinterpret as a prison, then you're really free.
I'm wondering if you could give us an example, because I'm imagining someone listening who says, I've had this experience of touching the infinity of awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I've had that experience. I've touched that.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm, mad in this situation, or disappointed in this situation, or depressed in this situation, I'm not seeing the wakefulness in that. I don't see that. I don't get it.
I've lost touch with it.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that I've, regressed or something, or gone backwards. I lost this awakening that I touched in the deep retreat or while I was listening to a recording. Mm-hmm. So how can you help that person see what you're pointing to here?
Okay, that's a good question. So let's say that we're angry at somebody. Somebody said something to us, somebody was really angry, and our mind is spinning. And we feel, as you said, we feel we've fallen back into the depths of samsara, and we're completely caught. So within the tantric lineage that I teach, step number one is, okay, don't try to just push away the anger and get away from it and get yourself back into some mind state where it's not there. We take the opposite approach. We make the opposite move, which is, let's come back, number one, into our body. And then we begin to feel, okay, my body is really activated. I can feel the norepinephrine, the adrenaline, the cortisol. I feel my stress hormones are really up. My blood pressure is elevated, and my heart rate is increased, and I'm on fire. So now we're in touch with the actual experience of being angry. And then we begin to pay more and more attention to the actual somatic feeling, and we begin to look for the, where is this anger actually in my body? Where is it? And we begin to look and we feel, well, my heart is actually very tight. It feels like it's in a vice, and I feel like my arms want to punch somebody. And what's going on here is we're coming closer to the actual experience of anger, as opposed to being hooked on what we think anger is and what we think its spiritual significance is. In other words, we've kind of already forgotten about this duality between my anger and then the freedom of, supposedly spiritual awakening. We look further and we can't find any particular emotion that's called anger. And then we begin to look into our heart, and we look into our heartbeat, and we begin to find that the experience of having a body, it isn't quite what we thought. And even the energy in our body, as we pay attention to it, these stress hormones running through us, the more we look into it, the closer we come, and the more we use not the thinking function or not even the seeing function, but the more we use the feeling into it with our body, feeling into the energy, sensing the energy, and allowing our somatic experience to take precedence, we begin to see the energy actually in a very neutral way. It's bright, and it's very vivid, and it has a kind of shocking openness to it, and something that we can't pin down. And then we begin to see that there's a transparency to this somatic experience of being angry. There isn't really anything solid in it. It's actually rather empty and open. At that point, we're not even thinking about this person who said something, or being angry, or even being in prison, because the interior world has opened up in such a fascinating way, and there's such an amazing universe of experience and energy and eventfulness in our body right now. The journey continues from there, and we begin to feel a sense of being free in a way that might be very unfamiliar. At this point, we're being free to actually experience what it's like to be angry, although you can't even call it anger anymore, because it is so energetic, and it's so freeform and so unpredictable and so vast. That kind of experience, then when we turn back to the person we were angry at, we almost have to laugh at ourselves. Sometimes that happens, you just burst out laughing, because you realize that what's happened is that person has been a catalyst to open up this incredibly interesting and compelling interior world of experience. And once again, the important point is, at that point, you are awake. You are awake as a human person living a human life. There's no sense of claustrophobia. There's no sense of being in prison. You're fully present there within your life. And I think the important point is that that kind of freedom is not freedom from life, it's freedom within life, and the freedom of life itself that our centralizing ego mind had not permitted us to see before.
Given that there are so many, it seems to me, myths and misconceptions in our culture about awakening, I want to dig a little further into what you're saying in relationship to other models that are being presented in this series.
Yeah.
So as I'm listening to you, it sounds like what you're describing is there's an initial sense of awakening to the infinity of awareness that's possible.
Yeah.
And then this potential to return to a sense of the underlying freedom, no matter what's coming up in your life, to see that. And
Well, I would
go
even
ahead.
say, I would go further than that. I would say what you discover is the freedom of life itself. Life is an expression of the freedom of the universe. And what happens when you enter your body in the way I've suggested in this example is any sense of limitation is completely forgotten, and you discover the beauty and the power of the universe happening in your incarnation. And that is true freedom. And so every human experience becomes a gate into the freedom for the universe to be what it is, for life to be what it is, if you see what I mean.
I think I do, but here the question I'm driving towards here is it possible to be, quote unquote, an awakened person who every single moment is experiencing that type of freedom? Or is it, I'm going to now look for that freedom in this, I'm all tied up and weird and I'm going to look for that freedom? Or is it possible that every single second, 24/7, is experienced as that type of freedom of life?
Well, that depends on you. It depends on what you think. I mean, if you feel you're imprisoned in the deepest dungeon of your ego, now somebody who says that every moment of their life they're awake, what about that experience? What do they do with that? Do they see that as freedom? If you see, what we want to do here, we don't want to rule out any human experience. Sometimes when you hear people talk in our culture, they claim that they no longer have relative experience. That's a very, in my opinion, very profound self-deception. Relative experience is where you find freedom. If you have a freedom where there's no relative experience, there is no quote unquote suffering, there's no claustrophobia, then you have lost a lot of what it means to be human, and you've lost your opportunity to discover in your imprisonment, in your torment, that is an expression of freedom itself. You see what I'm getting at? So it really depends on your point of view.
Now, unpack this a little bit. I think I know what you mean by relative experience, but I want to make sure our listeners are completely with you. Mm-hmm. So when you use that phrase, what do you mean?
I mean anything you could possibly experience as a human being. From top to bottom, from the highest heaven to the deepest hell. My question to you is, if you tell me you're fully awake and you're completely free, my question to you is, when you are in the deepest hell, do you see that? Do you experience it as an expression of the freedom of life, the freedom of the universe? Or do you not have those experiences anymore because somehow you've gotten yourself into a state where those don't occur? That would be my question.
Right. And let's say someone reports, this is not me reporting, obviously, but someone reports, I don't have those kinds of experiences. I don't have the experience of hell, of, that just doesn't come up for me. Doesn't happen.
Well, I feel bad. I feel bad for that person, and I feel bad for the people in their life, because how are you going to love somebody unless you know personally what they're going through, and you see that that's not a problem, because that's where you live. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I don't want to put anybody down. That's, heaven forbid, I shouldn't do that. But I think I meet people who claim that there are huge ranges of human experience that they don't have, and I feel bad for them. I feel bad because, to me, you see, I don't think the universe makes mistakes, and I think, the universe is doing all kinds of things at this moment, all over, all over, billions and trillions of light years away. And to me, all of it is an expression of life. And the idea that we as humans somehow have a problem, I think that's just an idea. We don't have a problem. We are manifestations, we're revelations of the universe in every cell of our body, in every dimension of our life. And I feel bad for somebody who's managed to get into a space where they don't know half of what it means to be human. I just feel bad.
Well, what I think you're pointing to, and it's one of the questions and themes that runs throughout this series, is the relationship between awakening and suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And there's definitely a group of people who say that when you really know spiritual awakening in your life, you don't suffer. You don't suffer anymore.
Well, what is suffering? What do you mean by that?
Feel bad. Feel yucky. Feel...
Well, that's not suffering. The Buddha felt bad when he died. Chunda, his close beloved student, gave him rotten pork. Buddha was in bad shape when he died. He felt terrible. But that's not suffering. Pain is not suffering. So there might be some confusion there.
Yeah. What would be your definition of suffering and your view of the relationship between awakening and suffering? That's what I'd love to hear.
Well, I think suffering is struggling with what you're experiencing. I think suffering is trying to wall off, certain kinds of experience because they're unpleasant. And I would say for a person who is attuned with their own life, aligned with their own life, I don't like the idea of awakening because it has all this, ever since the Enlightenment, when we talk about being awake and being enlightened, it has this bias against many, many aspects of life. So I actually don't like that idea of spiritual awakening. I would say more when you're really attuned with your life and you're entrained with your life and you see life as a matter of surrendering into what your life actually is and what you actually go through, then there isn't any more struggle. But I'll tell you something that comes down from the Tibetan tradition, which is there are no people who are completely there. And the minute you are there, you die. Trungpa Rinpoche used to say that for any of us who are still alive and breathing, there's a journey. And Rinpoche once said to me, don't ever trust a teacher who claims that there's no more journey. Because first of all, it's not true. And second of all, they're not tapped into their own life. So I think it's an approximation. And, we're talking about suffering. I'm talking about suffering as struggling against aspects of your life. And I think no matter who we are, no matter how embodied we are, that's a process that goes on, and there's always learning. The minute you are so-called completely awakened, there's no more learning anymore. And there's no compassion. It's said that in Buddhism that, the only way you can love another person, as I, mentioned just a bit ago, is if you're able to enter into their experience. Now, this is a very, very interesting point, for in the framework of this conversation. When you sit down with somebody and they are suffering and they are struggling as a bodhisattva or as a person who aspires to love others, you have to actually be in their mind and you have to feel their suffering in your body and you have to be them. So at that point, if you say, well, I never experienced that, what does that say about helping other people and loving them and understanding them? I mean, that could be a problem. See what I'm getting at?
I do.
Why do we have to have spiritual awakening? Why can't we just be human fully? Why can't that be our goal?
And when you say fully, what do you mean by that?
Well, so like you say, people who say, well, I never get myself into a yucky state of mind, or I never feel bad.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'd be curious, Reggie, to know in your own biography, in your own life, would you say that there were major events, moments where, if you don't like the word awakening, we could say attuning to the infinite potential and depth of the human journey was made known to you? Like, were there these like, yes, this date, this time, this happened, that happened? Mm-hmm. Are you willing to talk about your own life in that light, in that way?
Well, yeah, we could. When I was 18 months old, and I think it went on for a couple of years, I would go into a certain space, and I was too young to actually get scared, but it was what I understand now to be the infinity of mind. And I did, as I got older, I had some problems with it, and I thought, I looked at my parents and I saw that that's not where they were. And I tried to talk to them about it, and they didn't get it. And I started to think there was something wrong with me. It took me a couple of years to get that figured out. I thought I'd done something terrible, and I was being punished by this experience of the infinity of mind. So, for me, it's like, that's how it has been from the beginning. And my thing has been how to live my human life in light of that. How to be human, how to have a life, how to have relationships, how to work with the karmic situation of my own family in light of the infinity of mind. And it was very lucky for me to meet Trungpa Rinpoche, because he said, and he's the only teacher actually that I know that really was explicit about it, but he said, step 1 is the infinity of mind, and step 2 is what you're going to do about it. And I think one of the problems I have with some of the non-dual people is they think that step 1 is it. That's it. It's over. It's finished. That's all we have to do. But Rinpoche's thing was, that's the beginning of the journey. Once you figure out that mind is infinite, then the journey begins. And the journey is, how do we live ourselves, and how do we help other people, frankly?
Mm-hmm. Now, let's say someone's listening and they're not sure that they know in their own experience what you mean by the infinity of mind. Mm-hmm. Could you point to that right here?
If you sit down, I'll give you a little practice. It's a practice that you know and I know, and it's a practice that your listeners can also do. So sit in a chair or sit in your meditation cushion if you'd like, and begin to focus your attention on your nostrils. So I'm not going to lead you through the whole practice because it would take too long, but I'm going to give you the steps and then people can try it. So you begin by breathing, feeling the breath at the tip of the nostrils, which a lot of people know how to do. And do that for 5 minutes. And then you begin to follow the breath back and feel the breath and the coolness of the breath on your palate. And you do that for about 5 minutes. Just feeling the breath. Feel the coolness at the back of the throat on the palate. And then begin to feel behind that sensation and open your mind backwards behind the palate. And what do I mean by open your mind? I mean, just put your attention behind your head and imagine that there's something back there that you need to feel into, or you need to hear. So your attention goes behind your head and it goes back and back and back. At a certain point, you want to be paying very close attention to what that experience is like. And you might feel a sudden openness, a certain kind of releasing of your own grip on yourself, your own conceptual smallness. There might be a sudden release, and all of a sudden there's a lot of space back there. It feels very open and it feels very empty. Well, that is something that in the Tibetan tradition, as you know, is cultivated to the point where we actually become able to touch into that open, empty, and really endless field of awareness that is our basic nature. I think this is, brings us to a point where it's, we can talk about spiritual awakening, but it's so important for all of us to have some kind of discipline, some kind of contemplative or meditative discipline where we are actually able, using techniques, we're actually able to make direct personal contact with that dimension of who we are. We can talk about it up to a point, but at a certain point, if you're not willing to put some time in on your meditation cushion, so to speak, it's not going to become a matter of direct experience, and it needs to be. At that point, then it becomes, you see that what I'm talking about here is actually real, and then you become inspired, to follow it out.
Thank you. Another question I want to ask you, Reggie.
Mm-hmm.
I think people in the culture who have touched this infinity of mind might have had the hope or the assumption that that would then somehow translate into all of their life activities, their relationships and things like that, and bring a type of illumination into all parts of their life, and then find themselves quite disappointed when further meditation practice didn't resolve their relationship issues. And I'm curious how you view this, what you see at a certain point touching this infinity of mind. Does that solve all the needs we have in our life to be able to operate in an open, loving way, or do we need other inputs? How do you see this?
Well, honestly, you're talking about my life. That's my story, and it's a story of my generation, and it's a story of, I would say, the vast majority of meditators. We, particularly in the early 70s when many of us met Tibetan teachers and Zen teachers and Theravadan teachers, we practiced with them, and we did experience much bigger dimensions of our own state of being. And definitely it was the assumption by everybody, myself and everybody that I know, that you just meditate enough and everything's going to be taken care of. All of your issues are going to be resolved just simply by resting, becoming peaceful, and opening your mind into a bigger space. And what we learned, and as I mentioned, this was already in the teaching, but I didn't see it, and I don't think anybody I know saw it. But what we learned is meditation isn't enough, at least that kind of meditation. And that kind of meditation doesn't really change people, unfortunately. What it does do, of course, is it gives you a sense of solace, and it's like an oasis. And, I used to sit down in the morning, living, the same kind of life everybody else lives, pretty chaotic, confusing relationships, difficult job situations, whatever, and sit down in the morning and really feel that at least for, a period of time I could exit from all of it and actually feel peaceful. And that was very, really beneficial and very helpful. I was very, very grateful for it. But what I learned, and what I think, so many of us learned, was that does not change people. And nor does hanging around a so-called enlightened teacher change anybody. Fundamentally, it doesn't. And now we come back to Trungpa Rinpoche's comment that experiencing the openness and freedom of awareness is only step number one. It's the beginning of the journey. And what needs to happen, step number two, means we need practices that, as I said before, bring us into direct and immediate contact with our actual karmic, emotional, psychophysical situation and our problems, and, brings us into a space where we take on our own life as the content of the journey. So the spiritual journey at that point is no longer simply trying to experience freedom from our life. It's finding a pathway into our life, bringing that understanding of the vastness and openness and freedom of awareness, bringing it into the very core and heart of our own personal traumas and our own personal suffering. And I'll give you an example, if I may. Mm-hmm. All of us are more or less traumatized as humans. We now know that, having begun with people that are so severely traumatized that they become completely incapacitated, research now shows that virtually all humans have suffered and do suffer repeated traumas. And what are traumas? They are experiences that are too intense for us to handle. And so we those experiences which are happening in our body, we wall off awareness to those experiences, so they never get a chance to complete themselves through flowing through our conscious mind and resolving themselves. We don't, in short, we don't feel what we feel. We're not willing to feel what we already feel in our body, and all of those experiences, they run through a whole entire human life, and some of them are extraordinarily intense, and some of them are just, like water dripping on a stone. They go on until they just wear you down. The end result of that is that most of the consciousness and awareness of human people is tied up in keeping those experiences out of consciousness. And we may find ourselves in a state where we're not aware that we have any unresolved feelings, unresolved suffering, unresolved traumas. Nevertheless, 99.999% of our conscious energy is tied up in keeping those experiences out of awareness. And the human journey, the only way we are going to ever be truly free is by taking on that whole infinite network of trauma that is our human person, coming into our body, bringing our awareness into our body and right to the edge of our unconscious, and allowing the body to discharge those experiences into our consciousness and resolve them. I mean, this is just basic trauma theory, trauma therapy. When we do that, the body itself, as Jung said, wants to be conscious. We are not, our psychophysical being is not happy with having so much of our human experience incomplete, and unlived. And so the work of spirituality, to my way of thinking, is to begin to make room for our unlived experience to flow through us, to be experienced, and to resolve itself by flowing into our consciousness. As we do that, then the discrepancy between our conscious attitude, even if it's a so-called enlightened one, and the distress and the torment of our body becomes less, and the conscious mind becomes much more integrated with the awareness of the body. And through that process, our awareness becomes actually much, much bigger, much more inclusive. And then the so-called torments and suffering of life are really not a problem. They flow through in a very natural way. So I think that's what we're talking about, these two stages. Stage one, where you're not particularly tuned into your physical being, and then stage two, where you really take it on as the journey. So your relative person, your traumas, your pain, your torment, your suffering, and increasingly the suffering of the people around you become the actual grist for the mill of the spiritual journey, instead of being an alternative, unwanted reality.
Just two final questions
Sure.
for you, Reggie. You mentioned Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and the Tibetan tradition in which you've trained and are a teacher and a lineage holder. And I'm curious what you feel the role of lineage is in this whole discussion, we could say, of waking down.
in this day and age, that is a very thorny question indeed. There's a man named John McRae who was he died some time ago. He's a very, very good scholar, and he wrote a book about Zen Buddhism and the Zen lineages. And you may know in Zen Buddhism they make a big deal about lineage and who's in and who's out and who's authorized and who's not authorized. And what he concluded, and quite rightly so, is that the Zen lineages are basically made up. And they are the official lineages, whoever ended up on top in terms of the power and the titles to the properties and the money and the rich patrons. So what that really means for us is that the concept of lineage in Zen, and unfortunately it's also true of Chan Buddhism, and it's also true of Tibetan Buddhism. But when we talk about lineage, we have to really be clear. Are we talking about the people who happen to currently own the titles to the buildings and the official stamp of approval of the hierarchy? Because if we're talking about that, then that's a political reality. It doesn't have any direct relationship to spiritual authenticity and legitimacy and integrity. You know, people within the official lineage may have spiritual integrity, but they may not. And within Tibetan Buddhism, I would say historically, you know, as a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, I'd say more often than not, the people who hold the ultimate power actually don't have the spiritual goods. So we really have to think carefully, what do we really mean by lineage? What I would, you know, we could just throw our hands up and say, well, you know, lineage is bogus and it doesn't mean anything and it's a free-for-all. I would say there is an authentic meaning of lineage, and I would say that meaning is a certain way of developing personal integrity and spiritual openness, and it comes down in the traditions, but it's often not even within the official tradition. We see this, you know, all the time in Buddhism, that the really interesting people and the people who have been the most creative and the people who have really kept I would say, the living flame of what we're talking about here, of true spirituality, the people who have kept that alive, often as not, they have been kind of on the periphery. And it's interesting in Tibetan Buddhism because there's a lot of conversation about how the really impactful teachers have come out of the jungle, or they've been criminals, or they've been people who were beggars, or they have been people that no one even noticed. And that, you know, meanwhile, Tibetan Buddhism is very political, and it has this sort of very politicized view of lineage. At the same time, there are all these stories that if you want to practice spirituality, you have to find a teacher who actually has the goods. And that teacher may not be, you know, the person who's sitting in the monastery on the high throne. In fact, most often it's not going to be that person. So it puts us, you know, in the West in a very challenging position, because we need to, on the one hand, be respectful of the bureaucratic and the organizational tradition of these different religions. At the same time, it's very important not to get confused that we're necessarily going to find what we want within those frameworks. And I'm, you know, always telling my students, whoever you study with, you know, look for someone who actually has the spiritual teaching and that actually is able to present practices that will change you and transform you in the way that you want. And that person holds the lineage, you know, whatever their external circumstances may be. And where are you going to find those people? You know, how are you going to find them? You know, that's my challenge to myself and others.
And a final question, Reggie. in creating this series, Waking Up, what does it really mean? One of the things that I've been curious to find out from people is if they have a sense that more and more people are in our current day and age experiencing, we could say, touching the infinity of mind, to use the language that you offered here in this conversation, that first level of awakening. Is that actually happening for more and more people in our time in some kind of accelerated way? I'm curious to know your view of that.
Well, I think it's very important that we take a tremendously optimistic and hopeful attitude towards our spiritual lives right now in this world. And the reason I say that is because of all of the wisdom about human life that is unfolding in our culture right now. And I'm not just talking about spirituality, I'm talking about the amazing work in trauma theory, in neurobiology, the discoveries that are being made, about, our who we are as humans and how we work. And most importantly, my sense of optimism and hope comes from realizing that we actually have within us, each individual person in our body, we have a resource that has been overlooked for 2,000 years. And now, I'm speaking really from my own somatic teaching and the discoveries I've made about meditation when it happens within the arena of the body and when it takes the body as the gate to the infinite and the eternal. But the one discovery of the last 40 years is that we don't need anything outside of us in the sense of some religion, some set of teachings that's external to us, some teacher that's external to us, some, institution, some book. We don't need to go away from ourselves in order to save ourselves, so to speak. That, my discovery and my inspiration is that each one of us within our body is reflected the whole universe. The body is a microcosm of the totality. And of course, we hear that in the great religions, but what I've discovered is through the somatic practices of this lineage, you actually come into possession of that, and you begin to realize that within your body is all of the sanity and all of the health, all of the healing, all of the splendor of the whole universe. And that through journeying into this body that we have been given in this life as such a blessing, that the fullness of our own human nature can find its perfection and fulfillment, and we can make a spiritual journey in which nothing is left out. So how could I not be optimistic? The more we see that things outside don't work, the more we come back to ourself, the more we come back to our body, and the more we come back to our body, the more we begin to find the illumination that we've sought in all kinds of places is already present there. So I feel people are waking up to it, more and more and more people. And again, they're not all even spiritual practitioners. You read some of the people who work with trauma and you'll hear the same thing I'm saying right now. People who work with neurobiology. The body is the universe, and each one of us has all the possibilities of human life already present within us. And the awakening that we think we have to get to is already there if we're willing to tune in to who we already are.